Hey everybody, welcome to my series on key concepts and ideas in Western thought. Today I'll be looking at one of the most provocative, least read but most quoted, disproved yet misunderstood thinkers in Western history, the granddaddy of the unconscious, Sigmund Freud. In this discussion, I am going to illuminate a very thorough and novel system of thought that holds absolutely no punches on feelings or sensibilities. Not only do I believe Freud in his own right to be one of the most honest thinkers, right or wrong, I also believe that whether we see Freud's thought as just a passing fad 100 years on is worth considering or not, it is surprisingly thorough, all the way down to a quite considered ontological basis. What this means, as I will show as I unravel Freud's thought, is that he genuinely takes his ideas to the very kernel of reality, much like any of the most profound thinkers in Western culture. So when we think about Freud, we think of dreams and having sex with our mothers and killing our fathers, but hopefully in this video I'm going to show exactly what Freud was on about. So let's get started. Freud was born Sigismund Schlemmer Freud in the year 1856 in Freiburg in the Maren, which now lies within the Czech Republic, but at the time was a part of the Austrian Empire. He studied medicine in Vienna and worked his way to be professor of neuropathology in 1902. At this stage, Freud began developing a way of treatment that both persisted with the pathological perspective, that is, something that studied mental disorders as having both causes and effects, which did not occur randomly or at the will of supernatural forces, as may be discovered in other cultures. Now, while this was commonly accepted knowledge, Freud began to speculate that things such as, say, shell shock, which was thought to come from a post-concussional syndrome, was not to be treated simply with milk diets and the nurturing of the nervous system back from its infantile stage. Freud speculated that maybe it was possible that people's changes in characteristics and dispositions, without there being any noticeable physical damage, may be occurring from something unseen within the personality of the individual themselves. Freud termed this thing within the individual the unconscious. Now, to understand Freud is like working out a Hungarian puzzle box or escape room. Sometimes we must go forward, step backwards, understand the end to open the beginning, and so forth. While Freud's work develops through time, he is trying to understand something that is timeless, a beginning that we cannot really understand, and this is called the unconscious. The unconscious is the core of all Freud's thinking, and around this discovery, if we can call it such, Freud develops an idea about the entirety of reality. So while these days it's very common for us to think about the psyche as a real thing, and that the unconscious exists and manifests itself in real ways, at the time, this was a very revolutionary idea. So how exactly did Freud begin to understand the unconscious? Well, he developed the notion of the pleasure principle, and this concept is exceptionally important in understanding the rest of Freud's work. Freud began to understand that the core determination of life is in gaining pleasure from a very organic perspective. In other words, Freud questions or unravels many of the higher ideals that surround cultural projection, and instead begins to think of organic life, especially in its complex forms, as based around the heightening of pleasure. This he works out not to be entirely hedonistic, but actually the opposite. For Freud, pleasure occurs through the lowering of unpleasurable tension. We don't want to simply feed off our mother's breast as a baby indefinitely, or to ejaculate constantly as adults because of the non-stop pleasure it gives us. But on the contrary, if all is functioning well in an organism, it will simply lower pleasure as that tension arises. That is, of course, until we do need to habitually cycle through these heightenings of pleasure, more of which I'll return to shortly. The pleasure principle, then, is actually the way that life protects and perpetuates itself, meaning that for Freud, everything in life is sexual in nature. For this, Freud uses the representation of Eros, named after the Greek god of sex and love, and Freud uses this analogy to represent what is the pleasure principle, that is, the functioning of our sexual lives and the result of procreation. So while it's a little awkward for us to talk about a baby breastfeeding and sexual intercourse as the same sort of thing, For Freud, these are all the relieving of the same tension, and this occurs all throughout our life until our death. Now, while in some organisms this is quite apparent, in complex organisms such as humans, we do not have sexually developed organs at birth, and therefore we find stimulation at the most basic organic level, that is, at feeding, and this is what Freud terms the oral stage. This is the same use of the libido, eros, which is the protecting of the organism against death and its future ability to procreate. After this stage comes the anal stage, where the child becomes aware of their ability to control their bowel movements, followed by the genital stage, where we begin to have pleasure impulses from our genitals, and finally the sexual realization in later adolescence, in which the organism has matured and procreation may take place. So while Freud has now worked out quite a post-Darwinian way of representing organic life, his real interest lies in why these things malfunction in their processes. That is, if we are an organism that is highly, almost completely organic, why is it that we do not have relatively direct aims and pathways to achieving the goal of procreation? That is, if we all eat, defecate, become aroused, and then wish to ejaculate in or be ejaculated inside of, why are there such vast variations in this occurring? Or even, perhaps, not occurring at all? Well, to answer this question, Freud turns to some work that he had previously developed, that of dreams and their interpretations. For Freud, the fact that we have dreams, and also phobias, is a fundamental problem to logic. So if, at the time of Freud's work, there was a dominant way of treating strange behaviour through a physical pathological reasoning, such as described in Shell Shock, what if there was actually a cause from some place hidden, illogical, or repressed? In this way, Freud, through his analysis of dreams, considers that there may be thoughts, feelings, and emotions, certain experiences, that have been repressed from a person's thinking or their active mind, which he terms as the ego, the I that we believe ourselves to be. If we think back to the libidinal stages of the oral, anal, genital, and sexual forms, why is it that our memory of such stages is so fragmented or imprecise? Why isn't it that memory of almost everything before the age of 5 is almost entirely non-existent? If we cast our mind backwards, do we remember times of breastfeeding, thumb-sucking, being toilet trained, noticing our first erect penis or stimulated clitoris, and then playing around with these bizarre discoveries that feel strangely so good? Well, for Freud, these are the actual experiences of life, and these experiences will shape the very person we become as an adult. Experiences that are but glimpses in our memory, and only when we very, very acutely throw our egoic mind towards them do we remember even just partial memories of them. What this means is that our conscious state, our waking self, is in the world and responding to it directly through time and space. There is this other part, that when we think of memories and how they are sort of images that pop up, sometimes with ourselves even seen from the third person, we're kind of baffled by this other thing in our mind. Well, these thoughts, according to Freud, exist in our pre-conscious state, somewhere between the unconscious and our conscious experience. These are often in images without auditory forms and are not entirely open to us. Only with great effort can we relive these experiences from a first-person perspective, and only even momentarily driven with motion. Well, why is this? Well, if we return to the notion of the pleasure principle again, the ego, abiding completely by its need to decrease tension and protect itself as much as possible, will repress these often tragic or humiliating memories, so that in the here and now, it feels safe and hopefully likable to itself and the outside world, in order to survive. The moment any of these memories are brought to the surface, a certain uncomfortableness overcomes us, and this is ourselves warding off these experiences as though they happen to another person. This is why memories are so often fragmented, and more extreme memories can often almost be seen like they are visioned from an impartial observer. This is so as to dislocate the experience from ourselves and thus retain our own power within the here and now. So we're met by two concepts here. Firstly is the ego that lives in a time and space continuum, the here and now that it experiences live, And then on the other hand is the unconscious, that is timeless, that is, it exists in a fragmentary, backwards, timeless way. What Freud is expressing here is that the unconscious is actually just as much a part of ourselves and who we are as the conscious state that we believe ourselves to be. And sometimes these things manifest themselves in ways that we really don't expect, such as in self-sabotaging traits, in fetishes or perversions that we try on the whole to hold back from others. But when the symptoms are too strong, they become realized in the real world, either through things like depression or through hysteria and mania, which I will return to later. So in order to understand these sort of outbursts, Freud develops a psychoanalytic technique, which revolves around opening a space for the unconscious thoughts to manifest themselves. This is where trauma in a patient moves from its repressed state, which was done by the self-preserving and fragile ego, into consciousness, which Freud discusses as a shift from moving visuals to the auditory images, which is the ego's voice, this thing that hears and speaks our thoughts. So when we think of trauma and repression, we think of situations whereby we were helpless, violated or shocked, and these are repressed so much so that they can no longer be spoken about in the mind. This is the ego protecting itself, and it does a pretty miraculous job of doing this. So much so that only when they are constantly manifested outwards, in acute circumstances, are they really noticeable. This happens, say, in shell shock or post-traumatic stress disorder, which would perhaps be read as an image in the unconscious or pre-conscious that cannot stop cycling itself indefinitely, whereby the ego can no longer effectively repress the image, and therefore it can no longer be self-functioning in the world. However, what Freud is saying is that being a human is being a complex functioning sexual organism, and therefore this entire sequence of life-saving and then procreation can never be performed entirely properly. This means that through the libidinal stages of development in the oral, anal, genital and sexual phases, there is necessarily going to be some hiccups. So for instance, in the oral stage, the child links the nipple and milk with that of stimulation of the senses. That is, the lowering of tension of the pleasure principle. When this stage ends, the child is usually quite unwilling to let this stage go, and this is where it develops thumb-sucking by replacing the breast with itself so as not to endure the hardship of losing the pleasure principle. So while there's nothing wrong with thumb-sucking per se, if the child cannot resolve this traumatic event of the loss of breastfeeding in its conscious mind, it will harbour this trauma unconsciously through the rest of its life. And Freud links this to having the effects such as alcoholism, compulsive smoking, and the preference of foreplay mechanism during sexual encounters, such as an infatuation with passionate kissing and oral sex over sexual intercourse and procreation. Similarly, if a child becomes focused on, say, retaining fecal matter for whatever reason, it will literally become anal in later life, based on the pleasure principle has gained pleasure from withholding waste, until the expulsion of waste becomes an abhorrent activity. Now in a functioning adult, the individual experiences difficulty dealing with problems perceived as uncleanliness or disorder, and these associated with that of the body that is now seen as a repulsive thing in its waste dispensing mechanisms. In the phallic stage, this is where there is an infatuation with motion, and this is why people can become infatuated with cars and big engines later in life, as it is a stimulation of these senses. So according to Freud, during these stages there is either a lack or an obsession, which will in turn result in our behaviours as adults, representing themselves through the ego as repulsions or obsessions. Because these things, though, are hidden so deeply within our unconscious state, however, it is something that our egoic selves do not even realise that we are doing. And we all know someone in our lives that has these tendencies, which even we do too, but we're unaware of, such as that friend we have that always picks the same bad romantic partner that always ends in the same way as the last one did. So this continual cycle is our ego repressing the memory of the trauma, while our unconscious is continually trying to work out how to overcome this trauma through the world around it in the ego. Freud terms this die ewige Wiederkehr desgleichen, or the eternal return of the same, which is the drive of the ego to continually, yet unsuccessfully, reproduce the original pleasure that it cannot come to terms with losing. And this loss manifests itself in all sorts of manifestations, which Freud cannot really come to terms with putting down to just our natural behaviours as human beings. So as I have pointed out, there is something fragmentary and repressed during the earliest stages of our development, something that's unknown to us. Therefore, there is an unconscious behaviour in us that dictates much of our development, which I have termed so far as eros, or the pleasure principle. However, if our unconscious drive consisted only of eros, we would also not wish to do some of the things eros itself demands, such as killing for food. Here Freud takes quite a philosophical turn, finding inspiration from Schopenhauer in a thought that can only have been quite novel at the time in German culture. That is, the tragedy of life. This is found in Nietzsche from Schopenhauer, with its roots found initially in the Greek philosopher Heraclitus, which deals with a fundamental riddle of our existence. That is, how does life require life to live, and why is it that life's only aim is death? So now that Freud has considered the idea of the pleasure principle quite thoroughly, he begins to wonder a little bit more what is occurring in the psyche, and creates a concept for the human in the form of a very literary approach. Freud considers that, what if there are just stimulations and then resistances to these stimulations? So, consider a single-celled organism that lives in water. It has a barrier around it, without which it would just simply dissolve and die, immediately, importantly, returning to the inorganic world. So over billions of years, more and more complex organisms have begun to develop, and we now have eyes, noses, ears, organs that allow us to experience the stimulation of the external world without being destroyed by it. They have filtered through resistive barriers so that they are now communicatable to an ego without, on an organic level, being destroyed by it. So while this is interesting, this is where Freud really begins to think outside of the box. While the organism, and I am now going to call this an organism, as that's what Freud refers it to, slowly builds these barriers to external stimuli, there is no protection, importantly, from the internal. The organism has not protected itself from the inside. So while the organism has been focusing its energy on protection from outside stimulation, its inside too has been growing and expanding in a way the organism is completely unaware of. This inside, this completely unconscious otherness, Freud terms as id, or in German es, the it. So as I have said, Freud has recognized the pleasure principle as a part of our psyche, but it niggles on him how humans have such repulsive tendencies or actions, or even whereby the organism itself would willingly forsake its own life in the act of suicide. Much of this change in Freud's thought can be put down to the catastrophe of the First World War, whereby half of those killed were atomized, and the distinction between organic and inorganic became completely blurred. In contemplating this sort of other side to the unconscious, or the opposite to the eros, Freud now begins a new concept in his thinking, that of the death drive. So what Freud now considers is that this unforeseen internal in the psyche is the id, or what would be instinct. And for Freud it is its very sort of own living being within us. But this being is well beyond time, and exists at the basis of all matter, even the basis of the reality of inorganic matter. This is how old the id is. As such, the id is this absolutely ancient being that resides in us all, and is still compelled to what it believes to be, partially, as normal, that is, as its inorganic old self, dust. This is why we are met with a complex problem posed by the philosophers of Greece. That is why it is that life hates life, and even can hate itself for living. In protection of this, life gives us eros, that which wishes to protect itself, from death, and to reproduce itself. So Eros attempts, always uneasily, to pacify this death drive so that the organism may reach death in its own time. And in this own time Freud thinks of as our natural or well-lived life. This occurs when the death drive of ourselves or the external world did not shorten the wishes of Eros significantly. With this new concept of thinking, Freud now returns to the initial stages of the development of the libido in humans, that is, the oral, anal, genital and sexual stages. What we are met by now is with this pure instinct of the id. But the id's wishes are constantly met by the external world that halts or stifles its demands. So in the case of breastfeeding, when the breastfeeding halts, the ego is now met by the id, which needs to now be pacified, and develops thumb-sucking as a way of object substitution for this absolute blasphemous event on instinct. This is the first moment that the ego becomes aware of itself to some degree, and why we can have memories from this stage that are very repressed. This is where the ego is making a move to try and survive, by showing the id that it too is a lovable event, and that this is also a moment when our ego begins to manifest its illusion of control in this reality. Freud now in this time begins to consider mental illnesses in different ways. For instance, with multiple personality disorder, he speculates that this is when the id has been bargained with in too many ways. Therefore, the ego must necessarily splinter itself to appeal to all the longings of the id, such as its loving side, its violent side, its desperate side, and so on. These ways do not manifest in violent or desperate ways, but ways of bargaining with this side and suppressing it. So now that the ego is aware, but still acting completely under the desires of id, which to some degree we always are. So now, given that the ego has become more active in the world, this is where we reach Freud's most famous concept, the Eatable Complex. Still under the desires of id, the ego now acts out its instinctual desire, and that is to have everything, nurturing and procreation. And what other object could hold this more than the mother or father for the child? So in the Oedipal complex, which is specifically male orientated, the opposite being the Electra complex, the boy desires the complete woman, where it is both a life giver and a nurturer. But in the way of this is the father. Thus we have the name of the complex, Oedipus, the Greek myth of Oedipus, who kills his father to marry his mother and therefore become king. Unfortunately, in the real world, this wish is thwarted by the fact that your father can probably easily kill you, and your mother also is little interested in you sexually. Nonetheless, more often than not in reality, this occurs, and this is the first ultimate thwarting of the id. In reaction to this event, the id erects something in itself, called the SuperEgo. This is where the child erects the same object in itself that defeated it. The SuperEgo, or ideal ego, is in the character of the father, the one who defeated it. So now we discover in the child, because of this event, the creation of guilt and conscience. And during this stage, the more vigorously the child has been disciplined, the more exacting the SuperEgo will be over the ego, in the form of guilt. So while the id is completely inherited, through countless and countless egos passed on and on, the SuperEgo is created out of these memories, which will now stand over the ego and make sure that it conforms to the ways of surviving and behaving learned through previous cultural generations. The SuperEgo, then, are the unconscious wishes of the id and its desires that are then thwarted within reality itself. The id then manifests something to scold the ego, creating an idealized version that the ego should be, so that it constantly must struggle to live up to it. So because working just on instincts does not allow for survival in the human or complex world that we live in, the id now creates another part of the unconscious, that is, something that we can hear and live under, the SuperEgo. It is because of this new guilt and morality that the SuperEgo imposes over us that the distinction between the individual and society at large becomes blurred. So now in Freud's work we have the id, or its instinctual compulsions that we have no real idea of other than how we act out our lives, and then the superego, which tries to control and dominate our behaviour. In this way, for Freud, the ego now becomes like a constitutional monarchy who is required approval to produce actions in the world, but who also hesitates in vetoing Parliament. So in this way, Freud now considers the ego as having three masters. That is, the external world that sets boundaries upon it, the indifferent libido of the id that drives instinctual impulses, and then this severe taskmaster of the super or idealized ego that judges its every action and thought. Now, if any of these masters reign too supreme, they will produce results in the ego that the ego will then literally project forth into the external world. So let's now try and put this kind of analysis to work in our current world. Let's say through climate change, which is a pivotal social issue in our current environment. Well, what is this phenomena? On the one hand, climate change is a very real thing, but beneath this is a contest of the psyche manifesting itself through a wider social scale. On the one hand, we have issues of waste that go unabated due to the weaknesses or resent towards the superego. This would occur perhaps from the lack of discipline as a child, and therefore during the Oedipal stage of development, the id is left a little bit too unrestricted. This can then manifest as unsympathetic or cruel behaviours in an individual. Freud alludes that sadistic perversions even occur in the libido when the pleasure principle and the death instinct intermingle a little bit too much. So therefore, if a child refuses to sort of obey authority and social demands and norms, this is usually from spite at its unattentive parents, where there is a confusion between eros, that is, the thing that should be loving it, and the death drive, where the thing that it should be loving does not love it. This then can sort of lead to violence becoming a sexual act, and/or a sexual act must contain violence. In the reverse of this is when the superego has developed too early, and the mixture inverts into masochism. Whichever way, with this lack of superego is the lack of guilt placed upon the ego, which allows for callous or indifferent behaviour when it comes to the instincts achieving their aims, whatever they may be. So, on the other side of the coin is the domination of the superego, which creates a completely moral voice over the ego at all times. This occurs through over-disciplining, and when this voice is too strong, the ego, trying to live up to this impossible ideal set upon it, defends itself and projects the ideal onto an object, in this case, anything it perceives as against solving climate change. So at base, however, climate change here is simply a facade, an object for this projection to take place. This is when the overcome ego may project its own guilt towards something, and therefore take the voice of the superego itself, and therefore become a lovable, idealized object. So at base, what we are considering here is that instinct, or id, is transformed into superego when it is thwarted by reality, but it is still at base instinct at work. What may be hardest for us to reconcile is that the atrocities of the Third Reich were performed in actuality by an overbearing communal superego that was then displaced onto those perceived as standing in the way of this grand moral utopia. This is why many people who advocate for social issues, while passionate, can often come across as a little bit aggressive or violent at times. This is because the moral voice of the superego within them overtakes its balance with the pleasure principle, and thus they believe they are working under some highest act of great moral code. Unfortunately, on the hidden side of this is that the superego is still instinct. It is driven under both eros and, importantly, the death instinct. And in this way, the superego is entirely capable of both of their extreme manifestations. At base in Freud's work is a profound meditation on reality and the human being, an organism trapped between life and death, capable of hatred to all life, including its own, and yet also care and nurturing even of the inorganic. It is this balance that shapes the entirety of our lives, in which wherever one, even if through circumstances far beyond our control, is tilted, it will then shape the way the ego interacts with the external world. What we gain from Freud is that the I, or the ego that I believe myself to be, may actually be just a tiny portion of who I am and project to the outside world. To me, the genius of Freud is in recognizing this. If we can then reflect as far as we can through ourselves and with each other on why we may perceive the world in such a way that can seem so real, yet may actually be just a manifestation of traumas beyond our control, we may be able to calm these perspectives and not be so compelled to act upon them. In this way, we might be able to live our lives in the delicate balance between life and death, without being pulled like a dangling helpless puppet to crusade for urges or ideals that we never chose. I hope you liked this video, and thank you for watching.